11 before the hour, we turn our attention now to the race for the White House. The Iowa caucuses, believe it or not, just a handful of days away. Steve Shepard is campaigns and elections editor for Politico and joins us now. Steve, welcome. I can't believe that after months of campaigning, we're finally at a point where actual people are going to cast actual votes, with the caveat that in Iowa it's a bit of a different system. It is that caucus we've heard so much about over the years. For folks who've been focusing on snow and not politics over the last few days, which is most people, give us a sense of the lay of the land. Who has momentum heading into the all-important Iowa event?
Well, look, Iowa caucuses are on Monday evening, February 1st. Right now you have very close races in both parties, but you are starting to see some late momentum. Ted Cruz had surged ahead in the Republican side in Iowa last month. That made him, put him in a precarious position. He is now the front runner, and he has been the target of attacks, mostly from Donald Trump. You've heard the attacks on his stance on ethanol. You've heard it on his Canadian birthplace. And since then, now in the latest polls, you're seeing Donald Trump surge back ahead of Ted Cruz. So Donald Trump looks to have the momentum 6 days out before the Iowa caucuses on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, it's a very close race between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. In the past couple of weeks, basically since the new year, Bernie Sanders has closed that gap significantly since we got started here in 2016. And right now, it looks like that race could also go either way.
To what extent do the prognosticators and analysts hedge a bit on their sense of where things are, because to participate in the Iowa caucus, it's not go to the polling place in the neighborhood at the time of your choosing and boom, the ballot and leave. It's go out on maybe a cold night and spend time, potentially hours, in a fireplace or church basement or all the different places, local school, and really kind of plan to be there for the evening, because that's the gig. That's how the Iowa caucuses roll.
Yeah, you have to get there on time. You have to get there at 8 p.m. At a place that may be a few miles from your house. It may be cold, it may be snowing on Monday night. And you have to stay there. And it's also a very public, this is the other part that I think people forget, it's also a very public expression. You're not casting a secret ballot, especially on the Democratic side. You actually will go to one side of the room. If it's like a high school gymnasium, the Hillary Clinton people will be on one side of the room. The Bernie Sanders people will be on the other side of the room. The Martin O'Malley people will likely have to choose and go to one side or the other. But it's a very public expression of your vote preference. It's not the secret ballot that we're going to see the following week in New Hampshire. And, that's sort of an underrated part of this. It's different from what most of us in the country think of when we think of voting.
After Iowa, the entire political world, all the candidates, all the staff, all the media pick up en masse and move to New Hampshire, and then it's on. After all this buildup and the months of the campaigns and the debates, we're into the selection process. It's really, I mean, this is for real now. We're going to be in a new phase of this whole process.
Right. One of the impacts of what happened in 2008 on the Democratic side and 2012 on the Republican side, you had long protracted campaigns. It was a while before we had the nominees. One of the things the parties have tried to do, particularly the Republicans after 2012, is compress that calendar. So the Iowa caucuses, instead of them being in the beginning of January, they're now the beginning of February. And everything still wraps up. The final primaries are in the beginning of June. So you have this big sprint. After all of this buildup, we are now in a sprint. There are 8 days between Iowa and New Hampshire. There are 11 days between New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada. By March 1st, or by March 15th, a majority of the delegates on the Republican side have already been chosen. March 1st is Super Tuesday. Everything is going to happen very quickly after all of this buildup over the past few months.
Your Politico colleague, Glenn Thrush, had a remarkable opportunity. He had the chance to sit down and talk one-on-one with a guy who's no slouch when it comes to campaigning, the President of the United States, Barack Obama. He didn't go way out on a limb in terms of the Sanders, Clinton, O'Malley contest that's now underway, but for careful political observers, there was some interesting discussion of the race from the president.
Right. Quick plug, by the way, Off Messages, the podcast. Download it. It's 40 minutes of Glenn and President Obama talking mostly about the campaign. It was interesting. He had a lot of kind words to say about Hillary Clinton, also about Bernie Sanders, but he also said that Bernie Sanders needs to break out of being a one-issue candidate. He talks a lot about income inequality, but the job of president, as President Obama indicated, is more involved than that. And Barack Obama says that Bernie Sanders needs to talk about some of these other issues. He needs to talk more about foreign policy other than just the fact he didn't vote for the Iraq War in 2003. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of candidate Bernie Sanders can be, especially if he gains momentum by winning both Iowa and New Hampshire. The focus is going to be on him in a way that it's not currently, and it hasn't been since he got into the race last year. And how he responds to that, the media, Hillary Clinton, are going to try to force him off of his issues and onto these other issues, and how he responds to that will be really interesting.
We have 90 seconds or so left. The Republican establishment has watched somewhat in horror for quite a long time as Donald Trump and Ted Cruz have dominated the GOP contest. Even as we sail headlong into Iowa, and New Hampshire is just a handful of days beyond that, there is still, for some, optimism, a bedrock belief that there's no way these guys prevail. And that's despite a lot of evidence, Steve, because the
Right.
polls for those two men have been seemingly stronger by the day.
Right. It looks like right now in the polls, Donald Trump is #1 in Iowa, Ted Cruz is #2. In New Hampshire, Donald Trump is #1, and Ted Cruz, though only narrowly, is #2 in New Hampshire. If you have those two sorts of circumstances, it's difficult to imagine how Trump or Cruz get dethroned here. That said, I know a lot of Republicans are hoping, the mainstream Republicans are hoping that Marco Rubio, if he finishes 3rd in Iowa and say 2nd in New Hampshire, he goes into South Carolina maybe with some momentum. It's not just about winning, it's about where you finish, and where you finish based on what the expectations are going in. And if Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or John Kasich or Chris Christie can exceed expectations, then they can build some momentum. The other thing that they need is probably the other candidates in that establishment lane to drop out around them. And if there aren't decisive winners in that lane out of Iowa and New Hampshire, that might not happen, and that helps Trump and Cruz.
If they don't drop out, if they don't go through the process of actually dropping out, at least if all the air seems to come out of the tires, that for the 3rd place finisher will be probably the next best thing. To be determined as they caucus in Iowa and vote in New Hampshire. Steve Shepard, campaigns and elections editor for Politico. Thanks so much, as always, for stopping by.
Always a pleasure.
Great having you here. That is News Talk for this Tuesday. If you missed any of today's conversation, full-hour video available online at news8newstalk.com. Check out our Facebook page each morning to get a first look at our guest list. And for news throughout the day, follow us on Twitter. Wednesday, live at 11, we'll talk with D.C. Police Chief Kathy Lanier. I'm Bruce DePoy. Thanks for watching. Keep it here. The news is next.